Hey y'all, it's me again. I continue reading from my book, The 1910s. Let's go! Chapter 2, Entertainment and Technology. Woo! We're going to be learning about the entertainment and technology. The Hollywood Star Factory. Robert Langley Sommer. When the 20th century opened, New York City reigned as the entertainment capital in America. Patrons had their choice of plays, operas, and concerts, and the infant film industry stirred in New York and New Jersey. Within 20 years, the focus had shifted to a quiet community near Los Angeles, California, drawn by the region's agreeable weather, which permitted film companies to soon open for most of the year. Movie directors and producers gathered in Hollywood to create a string of full-length motion pictures, short features, and weekly serials. Ongoing dramas with suspenseful endings designed to draw back the same audience in following installments. In his History of Hollywood, Robert Langley Sommer explains the rise of that California town and its reliance on the star system to record incredible profits. By 1919, Hollywood had already become the world capital of motion picture production. It produced 4 out of every 5 movies and constituted America's 5th largest industry, grossing over $700 million a year. Many of the early silent movie stars are scarcely remembered now. John Bunny, for example, was an incredibly popular comedian of the 1910s in a series of one-reelers. People named their children for him. Francis X. Bushman kept his marriage to Beverly Bain a secret when they played spring lovers in Romeo and Juliet, 1916. So as not to disillusion their fans, but when the secret leaked out along with evidence of bigamy, Bushman's career foundered. The lesson was not lost on Hollywood, which sought to present its stars as unattached and therefore attainable only in daydreams, no matter what their marital status. But publicists had to tread a fine line between availability and promiscuity. Any hint scandal was box office poison. Some of the early science stars became legends in their own time, like Norma Talmadge, who is a beautiful leading lady at Ventacraft in her teens. Her sister Constance was a featured play in the Griffith Company. The Gish sisters, Lillian and Dorothy, came to Los Angeles in 1914 for Lillian's role as Elise Stoneman in The Birth of a Nation, 1950. Later, Lily Gish would recall that they had rented a 5-room apartment on Hope Street because it was cheap and I could ride the streetcar back and forth to the studio. The demand for more actors. Movie makers also turned to New York for established stage players to meet the ever-growing demands of film production. Opera stars Geraldine Farrar and matinee idol Wallace Reid made a fiery couple in Cecil B. DeMille's elaborate Carmen, 1950. Other crossovers from the legitimate theater include Russian-born Alla Nazimova, I think that's how you say his last name, enjoyed great popularity, provided they did not play roles that were too highbrow. However, many stage-trained actors could not meet the test of the silent screen. Deprived of their voices, they fell back on exaggerated pantomime effects that the camera magnified to the point of laughability. Hollywood photo players who had dreaded the invasion of big-name Adolf Zuko or a series of famous plays was a resounding flop. The public stoutly rejected stagey performers like opera star Mary Garden, whom they considered hams. Garden's tactless poses and frozen reactions led one critic to describe her film debut as a close-up approach to a motionless motion picture. Instead, audiences demanded established favorites in their familiar roles. Spunky Little Mary Pickford, seductive Theda Bara, Charlie Chaplin, the Little Fellow, and the dashing Douglas Fairbanks. Pioneer screenwriter Anita Loos, the author of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, tells the story of how Douglas Fairbanks Sr. became a movie star in the film comedy His Picture in the Papers, which the Griffith Studio produced as a trail balloon in 1915. It is a case study in the star system. Fairbanks vaults to the top. Fairbanks had been imported from Broadway, where he was enjoying a modest success in light comedy roles. However, his first few pictures made little impression on him. Griffith was preparing to drop his option while the young actor himself was increasingly homesick for New York. Lewis prepared a screenplay with humorous subtitles, much more extensive than usual, that starred Fairbanks in a spoof of the wealthy nearby community of Pasadena. She and her future husband, director John Emerson, also left in a spontaneous horseplay improvised by the high-spirited young actor on the set. When the picture reached New York, it was rushed to the Roxy Theater, where showman S.L. Roxy Rothafel complained bitterly because Fairbanks was almost unknown. However, the exchange had failed to deliver his scheduled feature film, and he had to use his picture in the papers. Roxy puffed up to the stage and apologized to the audience, promising to pull the picture as soon as the expected feature arrived. When the Fairbanks comedy began to roll, roars of laughter greeted the first subtitle. They increased to a gale as the film continued. Halfway through the picture, the missing feature arrived, and Roxy made his way back to the stage and lifted his hand to stop the show. "Listen, children, the regular film just got here. Do you want me to yank Doug Fairbanks?" "No, no, no!" came a reply that sounded like thunder. The picture continued to a hilarious end, by which time Doug Fairbanks had put an entire audience permanently into his pocket. Later, of course, the authentic Fairbanks became even more popular as the star of such swashbucklers as The Thief of Baghdad, 1924, and other vehicles in which he performed his own hair-raising stunts, swinging into a scene on ropes and descending the length of a velvet curtain by cutting it with his outthrust sword. Even at home, Fairbanks' bemused guests were treated to a running expedition of handstands, dives, and broad jumps. The birth of the star system. Other personalities were in equal demand by the public, which knew what it wanted, including Max Sennett, comedies with bathing beauties Keystone Cops and Mabel Normand, the gifted comedian. Sennett endeared himself to staid, long-time residents of Hollywood by spreading all out street intersections and filming the skits as part of his comedy. The public also wanted William S. Hart, playing the good bad guy in the cinematic Wild West pioneered by Bronco Billy Anderson's SNL production. It demanded and got action-packed serials that bridged the awkward transition from two-wheelers to features and confirmed the movie-going addiction of a nation. The first serial was produced by the Edison Company in 1912 to satisfy the growing demand for competitive products. The popular newspaper McClure's Ladies' World was then running an adventure story series called What Happened to Mary, and Edison used it as basis for several short films. The success of the format, which starred Mary Fuller as a little orphan Annie-type heroine, was immediate, and Edison rushed additional melodramas into production. Mary and Stageland, a clue to her parentage and the high tide of misfortune. The following year, Kathleen Williams and Tom Stency made the first action-oriented serial entitled The Adventures of Kathleen. The beautiful heroine was pursued by sundry villains and wild animals as she tried to lay claim to a title she had inherited in India. This improbable scenario was a great success, and in 1914, an even more appealing heroine appeared in the form of Pearl White, who played the title role in 20 episodes of The Perils of Pauline. The films were amateurishly directed and full of inconsistencies, but the public took Pearl to its heart and made her the screen's major serial heroine. She was soon copied by Helen Holmes, Helen Gibson, and Ruth Rowland, who made hundreds of episodic cliffhangers. By the mid-1910s, known actors and actresses were demanding and getting $250 to $500 a week. A far cry from the $5 to $10 a week and no screen credit offered to the first film plays at the turn of the century. A few stars like Mary Pickford commanded salaries in the hundreds of thousands. The basis was what film historians Austin Mayer and Richard Griffiths have called something indefinable and uniquely cinematic. A quality the audiences could identify with or admire. Personality was at the heart of it, and no amount of technique or even physical beauty could compensate for its absence. The inevitable result of the star system was that most popular performers increased their salary demands beyond what even the most successful studios could or would pay. In 1919, four of the biggest names in Hollywood formed United Artists to produce and distribute their own pictures. Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and W.D. Griffith. In the mid-1920s, they were joined by producer Joseph N. Snick, who brought in Norma and Constance Talmadge, Gloria Swanson, John Barrymore, and Buster Keaton. As the prestigious and popularity of the movies increased, the town of Hollywood took a brighter view of the gypsies who had encamped in its midst. There was a shift away from the mood described by director Alan Dwan, who recalled that in the early days, if we walked in the streets with our cameras, they hid their girls under the beds, closed doors and windows, and shied away. Now that the movies have become the country's leading entertainment media, the movie makers are regarded with more tolerance. The $5 a day. Henry Ford revolutionizes industry. Mark Sullivan. In 1914, automotive industry pioneer Henry Ford announced that he would offer his factory workers the then spectacular salary of $5 per day. Applicants rushed Ford headquarters in Michigan seeking employment. However, they found that with higher pay came greater expectations. The noted social historian of the first 3 decades of the 20th century, Mark Sullivan, wrote the event in a volume of his popular series, Odd Times, the United States, 1900 to 1925. For nearly 10 years, Henry Ford had been making the largest quantity of the new vehicle that was revolutionizing the country's life and at a price that made it available to the largest number of people. By 1914, more than 500,000 Model Ts were on the nation's then modest network of highways. Yet Ford, as a man, had attracted no attention. There were no books about him, no magazine articles. He had not been deemed eligible for Who's Who, the national roster of the great and the near great and the would-be great, which in its 1960 edition contained 18,794 names, including a Henry Jones Ford, who is a university professor, and a Henry P. Ford, who is an ex-mayor of Pittsburgh. But not the Henry Ford, who was an automobile manufacturer. In the newspapers, Ford's name appeared almost solely as a signature to advertisements, chiefly in country weeklies. A baseball player named Napoleon LaJoie, I think that's how you say it, was a public character, but not Henry Ford. An actor named Douglas Fairbanks was a public character, and a musician named Houdini. A moving picture actress named Mary Pickford, and a reformed touring robber named Al Jennings. A professional walker named George Weston, and a speculator named Tom Lawson. A dancer named Vernon Castle, and an Indian athlete named Jim Thorpe. A blonde girl named Helen Keller, and a champion swimmer named Annette Kellerman. All these and a dozen others were public characters. Their personalities familiar to the country, but Henry Ford was unknown. The name Ford was a brand, not a man. Merely a proper noun linked with an article of commerce like Fairbanks and Scales, Ingersoll and watches, Colgate and soap, Lydia Pinkham and female restoratives, Singer and sewing machines. Like all these, Ford was to the public merely the first half of a trade name. He was no more thought of as having a living personality than the dog in the Victor phonograph advertisement, or the Quaker of Quaker Oats, or the twins of Bull Dust, or the Bull and Bull Durham. Ford stuns the nation. Then in the afternoon newspapers of January 5th, 1914, Ford announced that as a way of sharing his profits with his 13,000 employees, he would pay a minimum wage of $5 per 8-hour day. On the first pages and in the editorial columns of the next morning's papers, Ford's announcement overshadowed the war in Mexico and every other topic of national or local interest. Sensationally a little appalled with a manner of believe it or not, the New York Times exclaimed, the lowest paid employees, the sweepers who in New York City make claim from $1 to $1.50 a day are now to receive $5 in forced plans. It was, said the New York Sun, groping frantically for a sufficient superlative, a bolt out of the blue sky, flashing its way across the continent and far beyond. Something unheard of in the history of business. An epoch in the world's industrial history, said the New York Herald. Headlines that proclaimed the sensation were followed by teeming columns of excited discussion. Ford became the man of the hour. His plan, the topic of the day. Quickly, the phrase Ford idea became as familiar as a Ford car. The discussion had two sides and innumerable angles. The plan was good, the plan was bad. It was a magnificent act of generosity, New York Evening Post. It was merely a cunning way of getting an advantage over competitors. It would make the workers self-respecting and independent. The workers would be robbed of their independence by Ford's paternalism. The workers would become homeowners, build up savings. The workers would. Time-honored concern of the haves for the best good of the have-nots. Spend their money foolishly. Ford was an inspired millionaire. New York World. Ford was a shrewdly self-interested businessman. Spotlight on Ford. To finding out just what sort of being this strange new crucis was, at once Midas and Messiah, to satisfy public curiosity about the country's mechanisms of publicity now dedicated themselves. In 7 days, the press of New York City alone printed 52 columns. All over the country, managing editors wired rush telegrams to Detroit correspondents who hastily sent out such casual information as was in their minds about their hitherto comparatively unnoticed fellow citizens. In dispatches to which they appended more to follow, writers and press photographers competed at Ford's door. At Ford's door was the crowds of applicants for jobs. Newspapers which formerly had sent only their advertising solicitors to the Ford plant now sent their star reporters, who found that, as the New York Times put it, there was nothing about Ford's demeanor to indicate that he thought he had done anything remarkable. Overnight, the press, from taking it for granted that Ford was no more public interest than any other citizen, now combed his present and his past for anything that would help satisfy the public hunger for information about him. Not only was Ford himself good copy, his wife, his son, all his relatives, his neighbors, his associates in business, his former teachers, all were tracked down by ubiquitous reporters with pencils poised lance-like. That curious and numerous army of baskers in vicarious publicity, the men who knew him when eagerly dropped their contributions to newspaper columns. They gaped like hungry birdlings and presses that panted for more. The public learned that Ford, like skating, did not like Wall Street. That after he had become a millionaire, he had continued to live in a plain small house which would probably rent for $50 a month. That in hiring men, he set no extra value on college education and was tolerant of former prisoners. One of his important executives was an ex-convict. That he liked outdoor recreation had adage. He later inscribed it over the open fireplace of his new house. Chop your own wood and it will harm you twice. That he liked birds. Once, to avoid disturbing a nest of phoebes on his front porch, he had used the back door of his house for a week. That he raised pheasants on his farm and had fed them custard. That he did not approve of professional charity. He had a principle. The best use I can make of my money is to make more work for more men. That in this business he was himself impatient of routine. So devotion to rigid routine was the very heart of his factory method. That he was rarely to be found in that part of his plant which was known as his office, and that he held conferences out of doors under trees. For his hobby and his law of life, the press reported was to produce a good car at the lowest possible cost. To save a few cents on each car, he dropped the strippers who painted his slender ornamental light yellow on the bodies. When salesmen complained that customers demanded more ornament, at a time when other makes of cars were sold largely on the basis of seductiveness of appearance, Ford's answer had been, they can have any color they want, so is black. This, the press reported, was the basic detail of the press by which Ford had made his fortune. His formula of mass production had been, make a thoroughly good car, make a few models and stick to them, thus avoiding the immense in the automobile business of equipping the factory for new models, make the car as inexpensive as possible by eliminating costly decorativeness, putting all the expenditure to serviceableness, only sell the car at the lowest price. By that means achieve large sales. By large sales, reduce manufacturing costs of each car. Use this reduction of cost to lower the price to the consumer, thereby get larger sales. And so on in an ascending spiral of expansion, which in 1913 yielded Ford profits of about $20 million. It was this $20 million that Ford now announced he would divide with his workers during 1914 by paying a minimum wage of $5 a day. Please comment, rate, and subscribe down below. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so that you can know when I upload next. And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. And on YouTube, let's get to 50 subscribers. And on TikTok, let's get to 50 followers. Once we do that, then I'm going to do something special. So, come on, let's do it. We can do it. Come on. And, anyways, please pay for something on either my eBay and or Mercari. Okay? Bye.